For the third time inside of a week, the United States blocking the United Nations Security Council from approving a resolution that denounces violence on both sides and calls for a cessation of hostilities between Israel and Gaza. A case of giving diplomacy a chance or siding with Israel as a default position. The United States ambassador to the UN insists Washington is, quote, working tirelessly through diplomatic channels to end the worst fighting in years there. Little did Joe Biden know at this time last week that he'd be drawn into his first major Middle East test as president, and that it would morph into perhaps his biggest challenge to date from within his own camp. Never has the progressive wing of the Democratic Party been so vocal in its support of the Palestinians. Can the same big tent party that rallied around Biden's recovery plan feud publicly over the fight between Israel and Gaza? After 4 years of unconditional U.S. support for Benjamin Netanyahu, we'll be asking our panel if the tide is turning in Washington, where for years now, Israeli hawks have relied on a coalition of conservative Jews and fundamentalist Christians. As for Israel's longest-serving prime minister, will another war with Gaza keep him in the saddle or send him packing? Today in the France 24 debate, how it's all become Biden's problem too. And joining us from Washington, Deborah Shushan, Director of Government Affairs at the Progressive Jewish Lobbying Group, J Street. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
From Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Daniel Pipes, President of the conservative think tank, the Middle East Forum. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And Attorney John Whitbeck, a former advisor to Palestinian negotiating teams, is here with us in the French capital. How are you?
Very well. Thank you, Francois.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Speaking from Denmark, where he's stuck to his schedule, the U.S. Secretary of State, again, resisting pressure for Washington to join those growing calls for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Monty Francis has more.
Offering the latest public statement from the White House, on Monday, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken reiterated American support of Israel in a conflict that continues to spiral out of control.
Israel has the right to defend itself. There is no equivalence between a terrorist group indiscriminately firing rockets at civilians and a country defending its people.
At the same time, Blinken expressed dismay at the hundreds of civilians, including children, overwhelmingly Palestinians, who have been killed in the conflict. But U.S. support of Israel remains strong. Over the weekend at the United Nations Security Council, the U.S. blocked any meaningful censure of Israel and a statement calling for a ceasefire. Members of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party have openly criticized the White House. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called Israel an apartheid state, tweeting, "This is happening with the support of the United States. I don't care how any spokesperson tries to spin this. The U.S. vetoed the UN call for ceasefire. If the Biden administration can't stand up to an ally, who can it stand up to?" In the meantime, Blinken said the U.S. is working intensively to help bring an end to the conflict and to broker peace. But some analysts have said there's a lack of political will.
I don't see the appetite to enter into a new peace initiative because it's not high on the administration priority.
It's an effort that has eluded past presidents for decades. Bill Clinton failed in 2000. Rather than mediating between the two sides, the Trump administration concentrated on brokering normalized relations between Israel and several Middle East countries, an effort that had no effect in preventing the current violence.
Deborah Shushan, why has the U.S. so far blocked a resolution at the Security Council?
Francois, I can't tell you why the United States has done that, why the Biden administration has done it. But what I can tell you is I think it's incredibly damaging that the Biden administration has done that. At my organization, J Street, we are calling very strongly for an immediate ceasefire to the conflict. We think it's imperative that the United States be leading in this effort and not blocking it. As has been noted in your broadcast, there is on offer a balanced statement. We think it's extremely important. I mean, the Trump administration had, of course, set back United States diplomacy, its relationships all over the world. had put the United States at odds with our partners. Here we have an opportunity to lead, to be a major part in drumming up international support for a ceasefire rather than blocking it. And we feel strongly that that's what the Biden administration should do. And there are very strong voices from within the Democratic Party, the president's own party, that are calling on the administration to do exactly that. And I would point to some very recent actions in Congress, most notably last night. You had 29 senators, the majority of the president's party in the Senate, calling very simply for an immediate ceasefire. And over the weekend, you also saw about half of the Democratic Jewish members in the House similarly issue a very strong statement that included a call for an immediate ceasefire. So I really hope that the Biden administration is listening. I think it's really time that it does.
Daniel Pipes, do you agree?
I do not. I see the president and the Secretary of State as holding to traditional American values, to distinguish, as you just had the Secretary of State quote, that there's no equivalence between a state and a terrorist organization. And more basically, there's no equivalence between people going around about their business every day and being hit with rockets from the air, 3,000 or so by now in the last week. Of course, there's no equivalence. What has happened is that the animus against Israel has moved largely from the Muslim world to the global left, of which you just heard an example. The Saudis are not blaming Israel particularly. They perform a statement or two. There's an indication that the United Arab Emirates has told Hamas to stop. So what we're seeing is a fundamental shift in the hostility against Israel, away from the Muslim countries where it used to be and towards the left.
And John Whitbeck, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the answer to your question is really quite clear. Prime Minister Netanyahu has made clear very publicly that he's not yet ready for a ceasefire, that he still has other objectives that require punishing Gaza for some further period of time. And traditionally, with only very rare exceptions, most notably Obama's Iran nuclear deal, American governments follow the instructions they receive from Israeli governments on all matters of significance to Israel. So I think everyone can anticipate that as soon as Prime Minister Netanyahu feels that a ceasefire is in his personal interest, the United States will advocate a ceasefire.
And to Daniel Pipes' point that the opposition in this case to Israel's actions has moved from the Arab world to the Western left?
Well, yes. I think that is quite clear. And you had not just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but 5 very courageous young Democratic women members of Congress passionately on the floor of the House advocating for justice for the Palestinian people, an end to Israeli apartheid, and an end to American complicity in supporting racial injustice, both in Palestine and at home, because the two are now linked, in the minds of young progressives, or what Daniel would call left-wingers.
The U.S. Secretary of State did say that the United States had asked Israel for hard evidence that Hamas was operating out of that building that housed some 23 media outlets, including the Associated Press and Al Jazeera television, the building that was destroyed by the Israeli Air Force. Daniel Pipes, the language on the surface of it and the actions that we've seen with the U.S. blocking those Security Council resolutions, like you say, it's a constant. But the language is different from that of the Trump administration. How different?
Well, the Biden administration has returned, both in this instance and more broadly in foreign policy, to the standard premises of American foreign policy. It was the Trump administration that went off in a different direction. So we returned to the usual. Yeah, it's quite different. The Trump administration, in this regard, saw itself as breaking with tradition and starting things new. and ignoring the precedents and the like. So yes, this is what we've seen. Remember, this is the fourth round between Hamas and Israel. First was in the end of 2008, 2014, and now today. If you look at all four episodes, you'd see rather similar American policies vis-a-vis the conflict, which is basically to stand by Israel and say, no, Hamas, you are not allowed to do this. Israel, yeah, you have to reply. You have to take steps to protect yourself. What's different this time is that the Israelis, unlike the three prior rounds of war, have been more determined to stop it in the future. They coined the term mow the lawn. In other words, you go in, you batter things up a bit, and you retire and you wait for the next round. This time, they're hoping to change the calculus so that Hamas does not try once again to send off, launch rockets and attack Israel. They're hoping to change the calculus for Hamas. Whether it's successful or not, we don't know, but it's certainly more ambitious and thus the stronger reaction than took place the three prior rounds. And presumably Hamas officials, leaders are regretting what they did because this is not what they counted on.
Deborah Shushan, you agree?
I mean, look, there is no total victory for Israel in this. Daniel Pipes and his organization helped to sponsor what's been called in Congress the Israel Victory Caucus, which is a very right-wing, very minority voice within the Congress that feels that there is a way for Israel to impose total victory over the Palestinians. And we've seen attempts at that again and again, and it's simply not possible. And so, what we need, what the United States should be pushing for here is a ceasefire and is a long-term resolution to this conflict. And part of that for the Biden administration has to be calling out the dynamics that have given rise to the current round, and that includes 54 years of occupation of Palestinian territories. And let's not forget what gave rise to this most recent round, which is, of course, the evictions in East Jerusalem and including in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, including the provocations on Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, including in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So there's no such thing for either side here as total victory. And while Daniel Pipes might portray this as, as a movement that you only see on the global left, I think what your listeners really need to know is that even strong supporters of Israel, and my organization is one of those, a pro-Israel, pro-peace organization that supports $3.8 billion in aid to Israel each year, and many in Congress who similarly are very strong supporters of Israel and support that aid every year, are calling for an end to these hostilities, are calling for an end to the underlying occupation and the dynamics that gave rise to this last round.
All right, well, the United States is not sitting idle. Go ahead, very briefly on this point, Daniel Pipes.
Briefly, just one correction. We're not calling for total victory. We're calling for victory. And that's a much. Victory means imposing your will on your opponent. We're not talking about 1945 style decimation and destruction. We're talking about victory. So please keep that distinction.
All right. When we look at and we've discussed it throughout the past week, as we've seen this unforeseen flare-up in the last week of the dynamics in terms of who's strong and who's weak in all of this. But Deborah Shushan, it would be unfair to say that the U.S. is doing nothing. After all, they have dispatched a top diplomat, Hadi Amr, who this Monday met with the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas. Do you get the sense that the Biden administration perhaps is moving cautiously because, well, it's playing catch-up? After all, they didn't even have an ambassador to Israel right now. They hadn't named one yet under this new administration.
Right. So the administration has absolutely, unfortunately, not been doing enough. And I just want to say, Hadi Amr is a wonderful person. I count him personally as a friend. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israel-Palestine. And it's great that he's engaged, but he is not a senior level envoy, an envoy that can go to the region, that can meet not only with Mahmoud Abbas, but also be taken seriously by the Israelis and be given an audience with the prime minister, who I understand has not met with Mr. Amr yet. So, we need a senior level envoy, which is one thing that my organization is calling for. But beyond that, you raise the point, and you're absolutely right. The United States still does not have an ambassador to head up the U.S. embassy to Israel. And at the same time, we should also note, as far as diplomacy is concerned, we're very much hampered by a couple of the actions that the Trump administration took. And those include, crucially, closing the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem. That was the primary body on the ground in Jerusalem that was charged with maintaining relations with Palestinians, charged with providing information to Washington about what's going on the ground, including settler violence, what's going on in the occupied territories. So we're very much hampered by the loss of that U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, also by the closure of the PLO mission here in Washington, D.C. And I should note that these are two things that President Biden has pledged that he would take care of, that he would open these two diplomatic missions. And so that's another thing that we are calling on the administration to do. There are so many ways in which the Trump administration practice, diplomatic malpractice here, and it's really up to the Biden administration to fix these things. These are things that, many of them that we encourage the Biden administration to do on day one, and certainly within the first 100 days of the administration. And we see that neglect is not a viable policy on the part of the Biden administration, and that's all really coming to roost right now.
John Whitbeck, is it neglect, the fact that Biden hasn't named an ambassador to Israel yet?
I don't really have any inside information on the ambassador to Israel question. There are a few names that are being bounced around. It obviously wasn't a priority. And Biden, as a practical politician, has seen people who've tried, including Obama on day one when he named
48 hours into his presidency.
Special envoy George Mitchell, that this has been a fool's errand. And doing the same thing again and expecting a different result has been defined as insanity. So he doesn't want to do that, but he hasn't come up with a different approach. I mean, I personally would hope, although it's a slim hope, that he would suggest that the parties consider a democratic solution with full democracy, equal rights in the single state that effectively exists, to transform the current apartheid one-state reality into a fully democratic one-state reality with equal rights and human dignity for everyone. I think that would be very difficult, particularly if Biden proposed it, for others to object to and reject out of hand. And if someone else important in the international community did so, I think it would be very difficult for the West outside of the United States to object to democracy and equal rights.
All right, so the question of what kind of a peace plan, one state, two state solution. Right now, though, it's about getting to a ceasefire at this point in time. When we come back, we're going to take a look how it's dividing Democrats in the U.S. Stay with us. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. It's been a week since all of a sudden it erupted in full in the Middle East, and they're still trying to get to a ceasefire. It's putting pressure on a new U.S. President, Joe Biden, who still hasn't, we were just talking about it before the break, named an ambassador to Israel, and who's dispatched in a hurry a senior diplomat. With us to talk about it, Deborah Shushan, who is Director of Government Affairs at the Progressive Jewish Lobbying Group. J Street, she joins us from Washington. From Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we are with Daniel Pipes, president of the conservative think tank, the Middle East Forum. And here in the studio, we're with John Whitbeck, attorney, former advisor to Palestinian negotiating teams. We were talking about a little before the break, Democrats who have, in some cases, come out in support of the Palestinians, in others, squarely behind Israel on this one. Their divisions for all to see on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives.
I rise to declare unwavering and steadfast support for the State of Israel. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are single-handedly responsible for the escalation that has led to the bloodshed of Israelis and Palestinians. No nation should be subject to a barrage of rocket fire like what we see on this easel on a civilian population.
As long as the message from Washington is that our military support for Israel is unconditional, Netanyahu's extremism, right-wing government will continue to expand settlements, continue to demolish homes, and continue to make the prospects for peace impossible.
This is our business because we are playing a role in it. And the United States must acknowledge its role in the injustice and human rights violations of Palestinians. This is not about both sides. This is about an imbalance of power.
Daniel Pipes, in the grand scheme of things where you are over in the U.S., tell us, is this a little bit of a storm in a teacup, what with, everything that has to go on with vaccination, the infrastructure spending plan, all the big issues that face the United States right now? Or are we witnessing a real source of division on Capitol Hill?
I'd say the latter. A real source of the issue today is Israel and Hamas, but on other days will be other issues, and it's between what one might call the moderate old guard and the progressive new guard. And we just heard a couple of those voices. It's a major division, and it will determine the future Democratic Party and to some extent the future of the United States. It's worth noting, in contrast, the Republican Party, which holds 50-50 with the Democrats in the Senate and nearly 50-50 with Democrats in the House, is almost universally, with the slightest exceptions, completely beyond Israel. So what you have is half the Congress really supporting Israel and half of it very divided.
You agree with that when you look at when you do a bit of a head count, Deborah Shushan, that U.S. public opinion overall squarely behind Israel still on this one?
I think U.S. public opinion, and we have polling that supports this, especially when you look at the Democratic Party, of interest to me, obviously, given that I work for a Jewish American progressive lobbying organization. When you look at opinion within the Jewish American community as well, that there are so many, and the plurality, the majority, continue to support Israel, but also believe that you can support Israel and at the same time be critical of the Israeli government and critical of Israeli policies. Now, there is obviously a division between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. There's no question about that. Daniel just spoke about that. The Republican Party has moved dramatically to the right in this regard, particularly on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It used to be that the Republican Party was solidly behind two states. That's clearly no longer the case, very unfortunately. I mean, if you look at the shift that has happened over time from, what U.S. policy was under George H.W. Bush, even under George W. Bush, when the U.S. was actively involved with the roadmap. Obviously, that has changed dramatically to the times of Donald Trump and now to the Republican Party of today.
And on that point, let me just ask you, how many Democrats in the U.S. agree with John Whitbeck when he said just before the break that let's just give up this pretense of a two-state solution?
a very tiny minority. A very tiny minority of Democrats would take that position. The Democratic Party remains very solidly behind a two-state solution to this conflict. And of course, what we need to do is not just be rhetorically supportive of a two-state solution, which is the only way that this conflict ends, but we need to also address the underlying causes. And yes, that means putting pressure on Israel to end this 54-year occupation. I mean, as far as where the Democratic Party as a whole is, there's no question that there are divisions in the Democratic Party. But I think you can, find a sweet spot that 85 to 90% of the Democratic Party would get behind in terms of support for the two-state solution and willingness to put some pressure behind or on Israel to get there. And that's where my organization is. And that's where we're trying to focus our efforts and get Democrats to come together.
Daniel Pipes, the Pew Research Institute, publishing an extensive survey last week on Jews in the United States, and they found that fewer than half of U.S. Jews give Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu excellent or good ratings for his leadership. Just 1 in 3 say they think the Israeli government is making a sincere effort towards achieving peace with the Palestinians. American Jews seem to be saying, for a majority of them, that it's time for Bibi to go. Your thoughts?
It used to be, say, the 1950s and 60s, that American Jews stood out in the United States as the ardent supporters of Israel. That's no longer the case, as we just heard. A substantial number of Jewish representatives in the Congress are highly critical. JC is highly critical of Israel. Jewish Voice for Peace is more critical of it. So that strong, across the board, Jewish support is gone. Instead, what's taken place in the last few years is conservative support for Israel. Just mention that. See all the Republicans in Congress behind
Israel. Deborah saying she strongly supports Israel. She just doesn't support this Israeli government.
I know she does, but I don't see J Street as supporting Israel. I think it pretends to support Israel in order to criticize it more effectively, saving Israel from itself. But let's not get into all that. I would argue to you that what has happened is that the 2% of Americans who are Jewish are far more divided than they used to be. But the half of Americans who are conservative are very much in support of Israel. So support has gone up in that. It's gone down in the sense that the young are far critical of Israel than the old. And this is something presumably that will out over time. So there's a dynamic. It's changing all the time. It's not the 1950s or 60s anymore. And so Jewish opinion on it is not so important as it used to be. It's conservative support for Israel that now really counts.
You agree with that, John Whitbeck? It's the conservative support for Israel that counts, not the Jewish support.
I do agree with Daniel on this. In fact, very recently, Ron Dermer, who was until recently the Israeli ambassador to the United States, although I think he was born American in the United States, said that Israel should redirect its public outreach efforts away from Jews who are too critical of Israel and too progressive generally, and focus on the evangelicals, who are much more numerous and really never criticize Israel because they're counting on the Battle of Armageddon to get them raptured up to heaven.
And by the way, that same Pew Research Institute poll, which said that just 1 in 3 say they think that the Israeli government's making a sincere effort towards achieving peace with the Palestinians, those same people who were interviewed say they think it's 12% of them think that the Palestinians are sincere in their peacemaking efforts.
Well, I can't speak to that, but I think also Daniel is right that there's a generational gap among Jewish Americans. The polls have shown this, that among at least Jewish Democrats 30 years old and younger, a higher percentage is sympathetic primarily to Palestinians than they are to Jewish Israelis. The older generation, people who've grown up with a favorable impression of Israel through decades, aren't really open to change, but young people who are focused more on social justice and racial justice issues are coming down on a very different side.
Deborah Shushan?
Well, you know, the United States, Jews in the United States are in some way, the most emblematic, the most, we are blue state Americans, right? We are overwhelmingly supportive of the Democratic Party. We're progressive. In Israel, we see the flip side of that, unfortunately, in that there's been a real movement to the right among Jewish Israelis over time. Now there is still a center. There's still a left. We here in the United States, in terms of supporting Israel, think it's extremely important to support those who support democracy in Israel, who support Israel being a state for all of its citizens, with equality for all of its citizens, whether they are Jewish or they're Palestinian citizens of Israel. We have witnessed here in the United States a real battle for the soul of America. And we saw that on January 6th. We saw, in terms of, you talk about conservative Americans, unfortunately, there is a substantial constituency among Americans who are more loyal to Donald Trump than they are to American democracy. And then there are those of us who are fighting for American democracy. You see the same thing in Israel, but the numbers are somewhat reversed. And so, we Jewish Americans who strongly support Israel, who care passionately about democracy in the United States, and who care passionately about democracy and human rights and peace in Israel, will continue to support those. We'll continue to support those who are out in the streets right now and rallying against the very disturbing intercommunal violence that we see in Israel on both sides, but especially with Jewish militia organizations that are provided protection by the Israeli police. And so, in terms of Israel's long-term welfare, is it really to the benefit of Israel, as Ron Dermer has said, to invest predominantly in American evangelicals who care about Israel because they care about the rapture in which all Jews are going to go to hell? Or does it behoove the Israeli government to really reach out its hand to Jewish Americans who still continue to care passionately about the state of Israel, but be concerned about some of the dynamics that we see there that are very perplexing to us?
Daniel Pipes, is it just evangelicals who support Israel so strongly, or Israel's current government?
Thank you for that question, because I was going to make a point. I'm talking about conservatives. I'm talking about people who are generally Republican. I'm not talking about evangelicals who are a portion of that. And even I'm talking about evangelicals who expect an Armageddon or a rapture to take place and Jews to convert to Christianity and so forth, who are even smaller element. No, I'm talking about conservatives, political conservatives, whether atheistic or Muslim or Jewish or Christian or Hindu or anything else. Conservatives. Conservatives support Israel, period. There are exceptions, of course, but overwhelmingly they do. And the more conservative they are, the more they support. It's quite clear. You start with conservative Republicans, liberal Republicans, independents, conservative Democrats, moderate Democrats, liberal Democrats. You have a straight line from about 8% support to Israel down to 50, down to 20. So it's very much a political issue. It's not about religion. It's about politics. And I would say, speaking as a strategist for Israel, that if I were concerned with support in the United States, I would look to those who support me and build that there, and then, of course, reach out to those who don't. But the fact that conservatives are the great supporters of Israel in the United States, and by the way, in other countries too, is something that's smart for the Israeli government to pay attention to.
Okay.
And if they're disaffected leftists, Israel tries to enter them, but that's not where it's going to come from. Whether they or they're not, really doesn't make sense.
We're running short on time, so I want to quickly talk about the issue that's pressing right now is how do you get to a ceasefire? We talked about U.S. efforts, and let's look at some of the others. Egypt's president, among those in Paris for a summit of African leaders, France 24's Taoufik Mjayed asked Abdel Fattah al-Sisi about Cairo's mediation efforts.
For the current situation, we are working urgently and clearly for a return to calm, to an end of violence and killings that are taking place.
Is there hope with the Egyptian efforts?
We are exerting efforts. There is always hope, hope with all moving together to end this conflict.
John Whitbeck, your thoughts on that Egyptian mediation effort and who's got the best shot of obtaining a ceasefire at this point?
I mean, I don't put much faith in any of these mediation efforts. I think as happened in 2008-9, 2012, 2014, the previous assaults, it will end when each side feels it has either achieved an adequate percentage of its goals or can end it without undue embarrassment and loss of face. I think this could be fairly soon because Prime Minister Netanyahu has effectively, through all the violence that was stimulated even before Gaza started launching homemade rockets, through this violence that started in Jerusalem, effectively killed off the threat that the heterodox group of anti-Bibi parties would replace him as prime minister. So I think his major goal has been achieved. I think Hamas has tried, and probably with some success, to fill the void left by respect for the Fatah Palestinian
the
Authority
Palestinian president cancels elections
after canceling elections.
Yeah.
And also, as a practical matter, there are estimates that in another 3 days there may be neither drinkable water nor electricity in Gaza.
So it's been a good week for hardliners on both sides.
I think both of the two contestants, have some reason to be relatively satisfied. I think the real question is whether this, unlike the previous three instances, will be a wake-up call to the international community to absorb the fact that this 100-year-old conflict is a problem of great injustice that does not deserve simply to be accepted and managed, but deserves to be seriously addressed and solved.
And that brings us back to a point that Daniel Pipes made at the outset. All those countries that normalized ties with Israel in the past year as part of the U.S.-brokered Abraham Accords, Sudan, whose interim head of state is in Paris for a financing summit, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who told France 24's Tawfiq Mjayed why there's no going back on the establishment of those ties with Israel.
Is what's happening in Gaza disturbing the Sudanese policy of normalizing ties with Israel?
Normalization has nothing to do with the Palestinians' right to establish their own state. Normalization means reconciliation with the international community, and Israel is part of that.
There's no intention of stepping back with the normalization.
It's a decision that only Sudanese institutions can make.
Deborah Shushan, your reaction?
Well, look, I think that Arab states who made the decision recently to normalize with Israel did so in part, in the case of the UAE, in order to forestall de jure Israeli annexation of large swaths of the West Bank. They argued that by normalizing with Israel, they would have leverage over Israel in order to try to move Israel in a positive direction in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And here we are, Sudan's interim president saying, no, they're two separate issues.
I don't think that they are two separate issues. I think that, and they were connected from the outset. In the case of the UAE, again, and with the UAE stating that the normalization with Israel was made possible because the Israeli government was taking annexation, de jure annexation, off the table. And so now is the time to really show whether that normalization can be leveraged in order to get Israel to stand down. And that certainly hasn't happened yet, but I think the burden is on the Arab states that have normalized to show that they can deliver some results.
And we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. So much more to talk about. Deborah Shushan, I want to thank you for joining us from Washington. Daniel Pipes in Philadelphia. John Whitbeck, thank you. And thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.